Shalom, Buruchim Habayim, and welcome to Shevi'im Panim LaTorah, to the 70 Faces of the Torah, and also Sulam Yaakov. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Vayeira, which means "and he appeared." And I have subtitled this teaching, "From Out of Darkness Comes Light." I'd like us to take a look at an interesting episode that takes place in this week's Torah portion, an episode that appears to be reprehensible, repulsive to many people, but yet also very complicated in understanding. And that is regarding the episode between Lot and his two daughters, in which they engage in conjugal relations with their father and conceive and become pregnant to give birth to the nation of Ammon and Moab. Now, in my teaching last week on Parashat Lech Lecha, titled "The Mission to Convert the World," I explained how the expression in Genesis 12:3, "V'niverchu v'cha kol mishbechoth ha'adama," which normally translates in that the families of the earth will bless themselves by you or in you, refers to the divine mandate to graft the nations into the Torah. And I explained that the actual word niverchu comes from the word havarik, which means to graft, not simply from the nefal root, which is varach, which means simply to bless, as it's argued in many translations or commentaries on the Bible, specifically those in the Christian world. But as Chazal explained, niverchu comes from havarik, which means to graft. And in fact, in Masechet Yevamot, the sages explain how Ruth and Ne'emah would be grafted into the Jewish people, and that their grafting into the Jewish people would bring King Mashiach. We see over here in Yevamot 63a, Chazal explained in the name of Rabbi Elazar, asking my dictive, what is the meaning here in Genesis chapter 12:3, that says basically, the families of the earth shall graft themselves into you. Okay, that the word is sometimes perceived from the root of varach, which means to bless. And the Gemara explains that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, said LaAvraham, to Abraham, Shetei berachot tovot, that I have these two good shoots, these two good blessings. Okay, yesh li lehavrich v'cha, to graft into you, the word lehavrich from v'nivrechu. And who are they? It's Ruth HaMoaviyah, Ruth the Moabite, and also Ne'emah HaAmmonit, okay? Ne'emah from the Ammonite people. And therefore, we learned that basically Ruth is the grandmother of David HaMelech, and Ne'emah ends up becoming married to Shlomo HaMelech, and that led to the dynasty of the kings of Yehuda. So when it mentions over here, Chol Mishbechoth Ha'adama, the sages explained that means even families that live in the earth who have a land of their own are blessed only due to the Jewish people. Similarly, when the Pasuk or verse states that all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him, it indicates that even ships from the Galilee to Hispania, which is Spain, are blessed only due to the Jewish people. And one of the things I touched base in my teaching last week about the end of this Gemara over here is that it refers to the nations of the world basically being blessed by grafting themselves into the Jewish people, which is essentially converting and experiencing the riches of Hashem. And one of the things I talked about is that in every major exile the Jewish people find themselves in, they always attract the souls of non-Jews with them. We know the episode of the Rav, the mixed multitude that emerged with the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim. We also know that as in the days of Nehemiah, Nehemiah, Ezra, Zechariah, etc., that as they came back from Iraq, which is Babylon, they brought with them a group of non-Jews that converted. We also know in the story of Purim that after Mordecai and the Jewish people were successful against the wicked Haman, that it said, mentioned many non-Jews across the provinces of that time that Persia governed also joined the Jewish people. We know that also many Greeks had an interest in Judaism, and then also many Romans. In fact, many of the great rabbis that we read about in the Talmud, they were also former non-Jews, Roman individuals that became Jewish people. They became Jews, I should say, and they also became rabbis. So what we see here is that wherever the Jewish people are at, the families of the earth are able to be blessed by their connection. And I believe in my teaching last week, I mentioned from Masechet Pesachim that the main reason Hashem dispersed the Jewish peoples into exile was simply for Gerim, to gather the souls, the sparks of the non-Jews, to bring them back to Hashem. Now, in this week's Torah portion of Vayeira, we learn about the actual origins of Ruth and Ne'emah. The Torah tells us that after escaping the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the 5 cities that made up a major metroplex, Sodom and Gomorrah were the 2 largest ones, but it was a major metroplex adjacent to the Dead Sea, a modern-day Dead Sea today in Israel, that we learned that Lot's 2 daughters, that they made arrangements to have sexual relations with their father in order to become pregnant, because they believed that the human race was destroyed. We read over here in Bereishit, Genesis chapter 19, verse 31 through 38, the Torah tells us here that first, Vatomer habechira, that the oldest daughter then said to the youngest daughter, they said, listen, Avinu Zaken, our father is old, v'ish ein ba'aretz lavo aleinu, and that there is no man in the land to marry us, keder, in the usual manner. Right? There's, how usually a man and woman get together. Obviously, there's no man left because the entire metroplex of Sodom and Gomorrah was just destroyed. So what do? Let us come, therefore, and let us have our father drink wine, an intoxicating wine. And they mention here, V'nish keva imo, and then we will sleep with him. We'll have relations with him. Un chaye me'avinu zara, therefore that we may give life to seed to our father. So they gave their father wine, excuse the typo there, it says wind, I'm missing the E, but wine on that night. And the older one came and laid with her father, and he was not aware of her lying down or her getting up. In other words, he was so inebriated that he was unaware that his older daughter snuck in there and did the deed with him. However, it was done, okay? It was done. And so the pasuk goes on afterwards, and it says, Vayihi mimacharat, that was on the next day, the older one said to the younger daughter, listen, I slept with my father last night. Let us give him some wine tonight as well, and you come and sleep with him, that we, and it repeats itself once again, that we may give life to seed to our father. So it says they gave their father wine that night also. The younger one got up and slept with him, and he was not aware of her lying down and of her getting up. And then the verse concludes after here, and therefore Lot's 2 daughters conceived me'avihen, from their father. And it says that the older one had a son, Shemo Moav, and called his name Moav, and therefore Huavi Moav Ad Hayom, and that he constitutes the ancestor of Moav to this day, the Moabite people. And the younger one also bore a son and called him Ben Ami, literally the son of my people. He is the ancestor of the children of Ammon Ad Hayom, until this day. Very interesting what we see here. Now, upon the surface, the actions of Lot's daughters appear to be repulsive, disgusting at most. Why would these 2 women, by the way, we know that they're virgins based upon Lot trying to offer them to the public when they found out about Lot housing the Malachim, the angels in the story that came to Sodom to pronounce a destruction on it, and therefore giving Lot a chance to save himself. And we also know he had 2 other daughters. They perished. Okay, if you're familiar with the Parashat, they perished because they were already married to, obviously, men of Sodom, and they refused to come in. The Midrash actually goes into great detail about them procrastinating and not believing their father, and sadly, they perished in the apocalyptic scenario of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then we know about Lot's wife, which is also interesting about her turning into a pillar of salt. The Midrash tells us that Lot desired to offer some salt with the bread that he offered the Malachim, and his wife was not 100% agreeable that he brought these guests in, knowing that the law of the land of Sodom and Gomorrah was that you cannot bestow hospitality upon sojourners. Okay, you can't offer them bread. The custom in those days was that if someone came in that was poor or destitute, it was the custom of the people to give them money, right? Oh, that's a very, righteous act. It's a gesture of tzedakah. However, the Midrash tells us that when they would take the money, they would try to buy bread and nobody would sell them bread. And so eventually the individual would die of starvation. And so Lot desired to, show hospitality, wanted to offer them some salt with the bread, the custom of the covenant of salt, things that he learned from his uncle Avraham. And so his wife was completely against it. She wanted the angels, who she didn't know were angels, out the house. And so, as we say, mida keneged mida, measure for measure. Because she was not willing to demonstrate hagmasat orachim, hospitality towards guests, which is another teaching I have in this week's Torah portion, of Parashat Vayeira, that's called Limbs of the Shekhinah. I would advise you to check it out when you get some time. Is that because she basically refused to show hospitality, measure for measure, Hashem turned her into a pillar of salt. And so the only survivors was Lot and his 2 virgin daughters. And so when we ask the question, why would these 2 girls take advantage of their father through intoxicating wine to have relations with him? I mean, to think about, just to even try to visualize it in one's mind is pretty, it's disgusting, it's embarrassing, right? Now, we could sympathize with them, that they genuinely believed in their innocence, their naiveness, that all of humanity was annihilated after they survived the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But even then, the Torah tells us that the location they fled to did have people surrounding them. And not only that, the Torah tells us that they both had, that when they both became pregnant, that they had sons. So if you think about them having sons, who were their sons going to procreate with if all the humanity was destroyed? Was their sons going to procreate with their mother? In other words, there was going to be a continuous cycle of incestuous relations, that the daughter slept with the father, and then they gave birth to the sons, and the sons going to sleep with the mothers, right? I mean, this is something that you see like on, American television, Maury Povich or Jerry Springer, or some type of crazy, show, right? This is the type of stuff you see on TV. I mean, this is happening in the Torah, right? And this is why a lot of people, they're not very comfortable when they read this episode. They don't even know why it's recorded in the Bible. Like, why did Hashem want this to be recorded? What is the meaning? What's the lesson here? So while the thought of incestuous relations is considered immoral and reprehensible and repulsive, Chazal come along. Listen closely. The sages come along in Masechet Nazir, and they say that Lot's daughters' plan to have relations with their father was considered, you ready? Was considered a mitzvah. Was considered a mitzvah, a good deed. Hold on here. Isn't not in Judaism, in the Torah, we find in Parashat Kirushim, Parashat Achremot, there's a warning that a relative is prohibited from having any type of pleasure from another family member. So how could Chazal come along and say that it's a mitzvah what they did? How in the world could they say it's a mitzvah? We read over here in the Bavli Masechet Nazir 23b through A, or 24a, excuse me, is brought down in the name of Rav Chia bar Avin, in the name of his Rabbi, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Koracha. It said over here something interesting. A person should always come first with regard to a matter of a mitzvah. In other words, the notion here is that when it comes to perform a mitzvah, you should waste no time. You need to immediately jump into it. It doesn't matter what's going on in life. It doesn't matter if you don't feel good. It doesn't matter if you don't feel like doing it. No excuses. You need to hurry up and do it. Okay? Why? As in the reward of the one night that the elder daughter of Lot preceded the younger. For what? L'shem mitzvah. For the sake of a mitzvah. So look at Chazal. They're categorizing the actions of Lot's daughters to have a relations with their father as a mitzvah. And it says that she merited to precede the younger daughter by 4 generations to the monarchy of the Jewish people. And so the descendants of Ruth HaMoaviyah ruled over the Jewish people for 4 generations, beginning with Oved, Yishai, David, and Shlomo, before the reign of Shlomo's son, Rehoboam, whose mother was Naamah Ha'amonit. Okay? And so we have to ask the question here, how can Chazal view the incestuous relationship of Lot with his daughters as a mitzvah. They're saying, see, look at the reward of the mitzvah. When you hurry and rush to do a mitzvah, there's a schar, there's a reward involved here. We find a perfect example of this with Lot and his two daughters, that the older one, because she ran to do this deed with her father, therefore she was worthy enough to bring a descendant into Klal Israel, okay, by 4 generations earlier than her sister who had relations with her father the next night. How do you make sense of this? How can this be considered a mitzvah? And not only that, what's up with the older daughter, her descendant, which is Ruth, coming 4 generations before Na'amah? I mean, the younger daughter, the younger sister, had relations with her father the next night. I mean, they're only a night apart when they conceive from their father. So what's that supposed to mean? How does one basically come in 4 generations before the other one when the pregnancies are a day apart? What is that supposed to mean? Well, it's obvious from what Chazal is saying is that because the older one took the initiative, that the timeline was expedited to bring in her descendants 4 generations before the younger one. In other words, what the underlying teaching here at Chazal is saying is that when you and I take the initiative, even in an uncomfortable circumstance or situation, we can alter the timeline. We can augment things, which can basically puncture the space-time, equilibrium of life, basically augmenting things and causing something to happen in the future. Now, this sounds fascinating. It's great, but still, let's think about this. They're using the example of Lot's 2 daughters having an incestuous relationship with their father. Mind you, they got Lot extremely inebriated. Okay? Now, I'm not sure how many of you out there have ever been under the influence of alcohol, or maybe you've done drugs. Okay? I'm not asking you to be nostalgic and go down memory lane. Okay? But if you ever had a serious case of alcohol in your body, okay? I'm not sure if you ever pass out. Me speaking personally for myself, I'm an individual that can maintain my liquor pretty good, but I never got to the point where I was so inebriated that I didn't know what was going on, okay? Or who I was involved with or people I was interacting with, okay? And now, of course, there's there's the mind state becoming intoxicated and, right, you're impaired. Yes, that I can recall, but not to the point of so inebriated where, God forbid, something with Lot, something like that happened. I don't remember it, nothing. I don't even know it. I mean, so I don't know what type of wine this guy was drinking here, but this is pretty serious. Chazal is still using this as an example to teach us how to perform a mitzvah. I mean, they go to the extreme by looking at a situation that the Torah later condemns and still use it as a catalyst to teach us how to fulfill God's will. How do we make sense of this? Okay, the notion that you can augment the timeline in the future when you jump on something early like Lot's oldest daughter, because her descendant came in, which then became the root of Mashiach. Okay, may be interesting in a very unorthodox manner, maybe something a little metaphysical, but what are we supposed to learn? We'll come back to this. What I found interesting was the R Yehezqel, Rabbi Yitzchak Lori. He explains in his commentary on this episode here in this week's Parasha that it was the kavanah, the intention of thought of Lot's daughters that enabled them to have relations with their father. So what does that mean? The word kavanah in Hebrew, okay, in translation we call it intention. But it means much more than intention, because if you think about what the R Yehezqel is saying, I don't have his quote to pull up on the screen, I'm paraphrasing him. Okay, the idea is almost like a premeditative thought, but it's deeper than premeditative. Okay, it's a thought with a certain intention to see something concretized, to manifest. Okay, it's like in the bodybuilding world, they have something called mind-muscle connection. Okay, in other words, here with the R Yehezqel is saying with Lot's daughters is that they had a soul-body connection. Okay, that their actions of what they were doing is rooted in something in the root of the soul, because kavanah is connected with thoughts, machshavot, which are also connected to your soul. So in other words, what they're doing here is rooted in a very spiritual, a spiritual thought. And the R Yehezqel teaches that the kavanah, their thoughts, functioned as the sole root of Mashiach. In other words, what they conceived in their mind that propelled them to do what they did, as reprehensible as it was only for the sake of bringing the soul of Mashiach into this world. They desired to bring Mashiach, okay? This is what their intention was. And therefore, even though it was executed in a manner that you and I would find completely, repulsive, the fact was that because the thought, the kavanah of it, was rooted in the soul of Mashiach, this is the way it came about. And so in relation to the older daughter, the sole root of Mashiach would come from Ruth, okay, from where David HaMelech emerged from. And in relation to the youngest daughter, the soul of Mashiach will come from Na'amah, who then marries Shlomo. And if you study the genealogy of Mashiach's line via David and Shlomo, you understand this concept. And so the comment from the R Yehezqel is based on the mystical concept of drawing down the soul of Mashiach from the world above, the higher world. And now, for some of you guys out there who never heard of this, one of the things you have to understand, okay, and this is where I find myself, where I've engaged with people in public before, that when they hear certain things like this, they're turned off from it, because this is not how they understand how the role of Mashiach works. But one of the things that people need to understand is that the concept of Mashiach is a rabbinical concept. Okay, when you look throughout the physical verses and chapters of the Bible, specifically in the 5 books of Moses, where everything must originate in doctrinal form, okay, you don't see a parak or a pasuk, a chapter or a verse that spells out definitive detail about Mashiach this, Mashiach that. There's what we call remezim, clues and allusions that you can derive something from, which are some of the more easier verses of the Bible, such as, when God tells Moshe, a Navi, a prophet likened unto you, and you can look at the Targumim on that, where it says, this refers to King Mashiach. But even then, the Pashat, the basic interpretation that will raise a prophet unto you, likened unto you, can be any of the Nevi'im that came into existence that basically continued in the role of Torah Moshe, that when Yehezqel, Ben Buzi, or Jeremiah, or Isaiah basically rebuked the Jewish people for their sins, their rebuke was not isolated. It wasn't in a vacuum. Their words were based on the Torah. By the way, these were Kohanim, right? These were not just nomadic Jews who, walked around as holy prophets. No, these were priests. So their job was Torah in the first place. So whenever they instructed the people, they always did it in the zechut, or the merit of Moshe, which is the 5 books of Moses. Everything they did had to be connected with the Torah. So when you take a look at that, and you understand the concept or messianic concepts, you have to understand, you have to rely upon the Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's the oral Torah. And yes, within the oral Torah, we do find these concepts, just as I quoted earlier from Masechet Yevamot, when commenting on Genesis 12:3 by saying, hey, the phrase there, v'niv'chu v'cha chomish bechot ha'adama, niv'chu, is from havarich, which means to graft, harkava. Okay, and so they say, what is grafted? Is Ruth HaMoaviyah, V'ne'emah ha'amonit. Okay, these two neshemot who are going to emerge from incestuous relations from their father are going to be the root of the soul of Mashiach, right? So when you take a look at these concepts that are brought down by Chazal, you have to realize that it's rooted in some type of mystical understanding about the soul of Mashiach. And so based upon the R Yehezqel, the concept of Lot's daughters doing what they did is based upon drawing the soul of Mashiach from above down below. Now, you and I, we may not think about that way. We think Mashiach is a tzaddik, he's a chassid, he's a very pious and righteous figure, he's holy, right? And therefore, he's going to come from a yichus, a pedigree of complete, excellent, righteous leaders. Absolutely not. If you look at the genealogy of Mashiach, he comes from a big balagan. I mean, there's nothing but flaws in the genealogy of Mashiach. So in order for the soul of Mashiach to descend into this world, it must pass through certain events that are considered to events that we would consider terrible sins. Okay? David HaMelech himself, right? Though the Tanakh describes him as a man after God's heart, he clearly had flaws. Okay? And so when you look at each of the individuals that make up the genealogy of Mashiach, clearly you're not dealing with an angelic figure here. You're not dealing with an individual that comes from, a pure, holy source of perfection, I should say. That's what I'm looking for. Perfection, right? That's what we see. Rather, the soul of Mashiach passes through events and situations that are linked to sinful activity, okay? The Torah tells us the soul of Mashiach that would descend from the incestuous relationship of Lot with his older daughter, once again, as Chazal say, would be responsible for Ruth the Moabite, who, once again, is the grandmother of David HaMelech. The Tanakh tells us something interesting, that upon her conversion, Ruth's marriage to Boaz was connected to none other than the genealogy of Peretz. We read there in Ruth chapter 4, verse 18 to 22, we read in the genealogy here that as soon as Ruth married Boaz, Chazal say they had relations at night in which she conceived, and then the Megillah picks up by saying, Ve'eli toledot Peretz, or Paratz, Peretz holid et Hezron. And then it says, V'chezron holid et Ram, V'Ram holid et Aminadav, V'Aminadav holid et Nachshon, V'Nachshon holid et Salma, V'Salmon holid et Boaz. And by the way, Salma, V'Salmon, they're the same individuals. Why? I didn't bring the Aramaic. If I would have brought the Aramaic in, the Targumim on this is very interesting because it gives a commentary while translating it into Aramaic. And you see the name Salmon there used instead of a sin, it's a Samic, and they also call him Shalom. Okay, it's interesting there. It's interchangeable with the Samic and back to a Sheen, and it's interchangeable with Shalom, and then they add the feminine suffix at the end with the Nun Sofif, Vav and then Nun Sofif for Salmon, which is rooted off of Shalom. It's another thing to go into, which is why the name changes, but there's a reason beyond that, which I'm not going to get into now, but nonetheless I digress. We go back to the Pasuk, and it says afterwards, V'Salmon holid et Boaz. Okay, Uv Boaz holid et Oved. So we see Boaz is the husband of Ruth, HaMoaviyah, that when they had relations, their son was Oved, okay, Oved or Obed is this is in English. Ve'Oved holid et Yishai, okay, gave birth to Yishai, and then Yishai holid et David, okay, David HaMelech, King David. So what's interesting here is that, we see that Ruth, when she converts to Judaism, I mean, she meets Boaz, and Boaz, being a descendant of Judah, via Peretz, okay. Why is that fascinating? Well, do you know what the Torah tells us about Peretz? That Peretz he had a brother, a twin brother. They came out. Was his brother Zerach. What's fascinating about Peretz and Zerach is that they were the product of an immoral relationship between Yehuda sleeping with what? His daughter-in-law, Tamar. Okay? His daughter-in-law. We go there to Genesis chapter 38, verse 37 or 27 through 30, and it says, "Vayihi be'et ledata v'hine te'omim." Okay, and it came to pass that she, this is Tamar, gave birth to, and behold, there were twins in her womb. And it happened that as she gave birth, one put out his hand. The midwife took a crimson thread, tied it around his hand, and said, "This one emerged first." And as it was, as he drew back his hand, and behold, his brother emerged. Okay, and she said over here, with what great strength, "Ma paratzta elecha Peretz vayichra shemo Peretz." And the reason why he's called Peretz, by the way, is because he's a poret. He breaks through by force. In other words, his birth is somewhat miraculous in a sense because he defied the actual, biological makeup of his brother should have came out first, but he's the one who broke through, and therefore he's called Peretz. And there's a whole teaching on this later on when we get to that. Okay, Parashat Vayeira, and it says afterwards his brother, on whose hand was the crimson thread, came out, and it says Vayichra Shemo Zarach, and so his name was called Zarach. Now it's interesting when you think about this event. Okay, what would be the odds? Think about this. What would be the odds of Ruth, a non-Jew, who is a descendant of an immoral relationship? Okay, she comes from the incestuous relations of Lot's oldest daughter with her father. Okay, that she would convert to Judaism and give birth to a son who happens to come from the genealogy, at least Boaz, okay, who comes from the genealogy of another non-Jewish woman that resulted from an immoral relationship, which is Judah sleeping with his daughter-in-law Tamar, that gave birth to Peretz and Zerach. What would be the odds? You know what? It would be mathematically impossible that these events would repeat itself. But as Chazal say, Maseh avot simen lebanim, that the actions of the fathers become a sign for the children, and therefore Jewish history is cyclical. It repeats itself at different intervals, but at an ascending climax, if you will. It's not just cyclical, running stationary in a circle, but it's ascending. So if you think about this, it's mathematically impossible. So why does Hashem use such sinful acts to bring Mashiach? Why does God use these events when people's engaged in certain activities that you and I would consider repulsive? When Lot's daughters planned to have relations with him, it's interesting that they said, V'nish keva imo, unchaye me'avinu zara, that we are doing this, we are going to have sexual relations with our father for what? To maintain life through the seed of our father. Now what's interesting about that? Take a look here in Genesis 19:33. I have highlighted in yellow. When they say, let us lay with him, give him drink, and v'nish keva, that's just a representation of having, conjugal actions with him, imo. Why? Unchaye me'avinu zara, that we may give life to the seed of our father. What's fascinating about that, you might be thinking? Well, it's interesting that Lot's daughters did not say that their sexual encounter with Lot was to maintain life through a ben, through a son, but rather through a zara, through a seed of their father. So what does this mean? Chazal explained to us that by using the word zara, seed, instead of ben, a son, is that Lot's daughters desired to give birth to King Mashiach. Take a look here what it says in Ruth Rabbah, the Midrash to Ruth, brought down the name of Rav Tachuma, in the name of Rav Shmuel. It says over there, it says, Amar Shema Kativ in Genesis 19:32. Un chaye me'avinu zara, ein kativ ka'an ben. It says zara, not ben. Eli zara, it refers to seed. Otzo hazera shehu ba mimakom acher, which indicates that this refers to a seed that comes from another makom, another location. Ve'ezeh, where is this location? Ze melech HaMashiach. It is King Mashiach. Now, Chazal's words are interesting when you look at it in the Hebrew. I'm going to argue, even the translation here, which comes from Art Scroll, I gleaned off of, but I didn't highlight anything in the Hebrew. But the language is interesting because they say ve'ezeh, which, zeh means this, like from where is this? What is this location, this makom? They say zeh is Melech Mashiach. But if you understand the word makom, when it says here, Otzo hazera shechu ba mi makom, it's going to come me from makom, another source. Literally, makom is another name for Hashem. They're saying here, what Chazal is saying indirectly here, is that this source, makom, Mashiach, is going to come from Hashem in a unique place. In other words, when Lot's daughters mention Zara versus Ben, that the purpose of doing this is just to have a son, right? Think about it. Because if the idea of what they were to do was to preserve humanity, God just destroyed all of mankind, how are we going to procreate? Who's going to have children, right? Like the whole Mabul, the destruction of the flood, right? Who's going to continue the human race? If the whole purpose was just to have physical progeny, they would use the word son or a bat or daughter, but they don't. They use the word zara, seed. And Chazal say it's interesting. And they say the seed itself comes from another place. Another place. Makom means Hashem. In other words, King Mashiach is going to come as a result of Hashem. What does that mean? What does that mean? Is that Hashem pregnated them? No. What this reveals is that Mashiach is not some special religious figure that many people perceive him as. Rather, Hashem is the one orchestrating how the soul of Mashiach is going to come into existence through all these sinful events that take place. He's molding the personality of Mashiach to descend into time via the flaws of humanity. In fact, Rav Yosef Soloveitchik, he comments upon this concept in his commentary, and this is what he says. The personality of King Mashiach is not monotonic. In other words, it's not bland, it's not boring. God weaves the personality of the Mashiach with vast amounts of multicolored threads like Ketoned Yosef, like the garment of Joseph. Now that's interesting because we all know the story of Joseph, right? We know that Joseph was a unique individual who had dreams and aspirations. And by the way, his dreams were beyond sitting inside of a shul, okay? Sitting inside of a synagogue, finding God. His dreams were required for him to be in a place of influence. He had to be in a place of government. However, his understanding in the physical world also had to be complementary with the spiritual world. He had to learn to fuse the two together, which is what made him instrumental at that time in history. And what do we see with Joseph? Joseph is betrayed by his brothers. They wanted to kill him because they believed he was a false prophet. And then he's thrown into the house of Potiphar, whose wife had the eyes on him. And according to Chazal, the reason why she had the hots for him is because Potiphar himself was a homosexual that only basically had relations with his wife for the sake of procreation. And so Joseph had an opportunity to basically be this young little playboy, Jewish playboy in the house of Potiphar with his wife. And yet, instead of giving in, he ran, he fled, and then he was thrown into jail. And so one of the things that we looked at Joseph's life is that, hey, Joseph himself, okay, is not an individual who comes from a great source of holiness. He had to do battle with his Yetzer Hara. Not only that, his story from his father is interesting because we know that he came into the world via Yaakov and Rachel, but even then, Yaakov went through 21 years under the house of Laban. So what we see here is that the Ketoned Yosef, what Chazal is saying here, is an image of life, of going through various struggles and trials and tribulations. This is the personality of Mashiach, the sinful relations of Lot and his daughters, of David HaMelech and his whole thing where he went through. In other words, Mashiach is not this great Sadiq or Gadol Hadar in a sense of a religious way. He's a man who comes from serious problems. Rav Soloveitchik goes on to say, the soul of Mashiach is iridescent, multi-talented, rich in thought-filled volition, and will be endowed with talents that seem mutually exclusive. But everything good and fine and noble in man, look what it says, must be passed on to the Mashiach. He must absorb them. It must be a part of his DNA. He will have the capacity for givura and chesed. In other words, he will learn how to stand in the balance between acts of righteousness, of serious justice, and also benevolence. He will be a hero with unlimited power and strength who will defend justice. Many of these things are also paraphrases from the book of Isaiah. And it says he will also be a man of unlimited loving kindness, humble and simple. All these capabilities, capacities, and talents will merge in beautiful harmony in King Mashiach. Rav Soloveitchik says the Torah is so interested in telling us the strange story of the act of incest that took place in the case. Why else would the Torah record such a sinful event? Look what he says. It's not a story of incense. It's not a story of some type of reprehensible, repulsive act that you and I think. Rav Soloveitchik says, no, friend, this is the story of the Mashiach. And then he goes on to conclude, the plan by Lot's daughters is considered reprehensible, but their motivation was heroic. They desire for King Mashiach to save the world. Indeed, he will achieve what his great-grandmothers wanted to do. The great-great-grandson, King Mashiach, would accomplish what Lot's daughters cannot. King Mashiach must be endowed with heroic qualities, for he is coming to change the status quo, to revolutionize concepts and opinions, to transform our hashkafa, our outlook on life. Our outlook on life. Fascinating what Rav Soloveitchik says over here. So in other words, friends, contrary to many people's opinions of what they think Mashiach is what he's not. And so the plan by Lot's daughters, okay, well, we look at it as something nasty, embarrassing, okay? They had a desire to bring Mashiach in the world. So the soul of Mashiach comes from a place of imperfection, of flaw, of sin. This is who he is. He's made up of Gentile ancestry and Jewish ancestry. And who's the one behind it? As I just quoted from the Midrash, Hashem is. He comes from this makom. Hashem is the source. Hashem is the one who's orchestrating it. Hashem is the one seeing what's happening. Hashem knows what Lot's daughters were doing. And he allowed it to happen because he saw their attention. In fact, Rabbeinu Bachaya, in his commentary, he explains that it was Hashem himself was the one behind the entire thing. Like the Wizard of Oz. He's the one behind the curtain. Look what he says here. This is interesting. It says they gave their father, Avihen Yain, Balaylahu, that night. Look at it. He's looking at the grammar. He says, no, the Torah should have written Balayla Ha-hu. It should have had an extra hey there. Instead of writing Balayla Hu, the absence of the prefix hey suggests that the word hu is a reference to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He. That is one of His other titles, one of His names. This is why the sages said that Lot's daughters enjoying a divine assist in their undertaking. Once again, he's alluding to the Midrash I just quoted from with the word makom. The wine itself was found in their cave. They didn't bring it with them. What do you think? They were schlepping a whole bottle of liquor with them from Sodom? Who had time to stop at the wine store? It says the wine itself was there. They did not bring with them. God had provided it to make their undertakings easier. God's interest was to commence the process which would ultimately result in the birth of David HaMelech, who is the ancestor of King Mashiach. In fact, another source brought down in the Zohar and a few other rabbinical commentaries, they mentioned that wine, which was very, very strong and intoxicating for Lot not to know what happened to him, to a point where he was almost like in a state of being sedated, okay, is that Chazal mentioned that wine that was in that cave goes all the way back to a grapevine of Noah. We know the story, as I shared in Parashat Noah. Noah went from this Ish Sadiq to this Ish Ha'adamah. He debased himself through the intoxicating liquor of the actual planting of a vineyard. The Zohar mentions that this wine came from Gad Eden with Adam. Is that true 100%? Not sure, I wasn't there, but I would say on a scientific note that we do know that in the pre-flood world, the existence of man and nature itself was different. In fact, Chazal mentioned that man held double the hemoglobin, okay? And they can contain more oxygen. Their skulls were more elongated. That's why when they find these archaeological digs of elongated skulls and they're trying to figure out, was this like an alien or another form of man, Cro-Magnon man, Australopithecus, and all this other stuff that go, in archaeological digs, is that the Midrash mentions, no, this is just a very advanced human being at that time in the pre-flood world. And they mentioned that our grass that's green today and the foliage on trees that are green used to be a hue of blue because the oxygen was so rich that the grass was blue, the trees were blue. And that's also the concept of why we have a techelet, a bluish strand cord that resembles the sky. And so it's very possible that Noah and his exiting of the ark, when he planted the vineyard, that when the earth's atmosphere was going through changes, yes, it's very possible that, he produced a very, very intoxicated form of wine that comes from the pre-flood world. Maybe this wine that's in Gad Eden, which I question because Gad Eden was a different dimension, okay? Wasn't completely physical. So what Noah produced may have been basically a couple jars left in the cave, someone picked up and it was hidden there, but Hashem allowed it to be there. So what we see what Rabbeinu Bachai is saying is that Hashem was the one assisting this. Hashem is the one that had an extra, barrel of wine there to get Lot completely intoxicated at his makeshift bar in the cave, in his man cave there, and which led his daughters to do this act. This is also interesting, as Rabbeinu Bachai has said, that God did this ultimately for the soul of Mashiach via David HaMelech. The Midrash tells us that it says Matziti David Avdi, that Hashem found his servant David, and it asks where Matziti Oto Besodom, that he found him in Sodom is where he found him at. It says there in Bereishit Rabbah 50:10. it mentions over there, Rav Tovia ben Yitzhak said that we find over here Shetei Mitziot, two findings. Okay, who Ruth HaMoaviyah, Ruth the Moabite, v'Ne'emah HaAmonit, and Ne'emah. Rav Yitzhak said that, mentioning based on Psalm chapter 89:21, God mentioned over there, Matzati David Abdi, I found my servant David. Where? Where'd you find him at? The Midrash says, Checha Matzati Oto B'Sodom, that I found him in Sodom. Where was he at in Sodom? He was with Lot. He was with Lot's two daughters. Okay? The spark of Mashiach's soul was contained in their DNA. Okay? This is also another secret why later on in the Chumash Bamidbar Numbers, when we get to Parashat Balak, when Balak goes to hire Bilam, the false prophet, right? You don't read that Hashem commanded Moshe Rabbeinu to take that certain path or to confront Balak and the people of Moab, right? Why was that? Why did Moshe and the Jewish people schlep that way? Why did they say, hey, we're going to go? Now, of course, Moab was on the eastern end of the Jordan, okay? And that's eventually the way the Jews came in, so that might be just the coordinates that they took in those days, and that was the access point to go into Eretz Israel under Joshua's leadership later on. But why would they be confrontational with Balak? That Balak initiated the actual, basically war first by going to hire Bilam. Why is that? What's going on here? God is very silent. And the reason why Moshe did what he did, because the Jews were on a mission to gather the soul of Mashiach from Balak. If you don't know who Balak is the great-grandfather of Ruth HaMoaviyah. Okay, she descends from that guy right there, that coward. That's who she comes from. So Moshe and them's message to Balak was, we're coming to claim King Mashiach. King Mashiach comes from a Rasha such as Balak. Mind-blowing. But the Midrash tells us that it goes back beyond that. In Sodom and Gomorrah. Now you have to understand, Lot, when he made the stupid mistake of fighting with his uncle's shepherds, okay, when they left Mitzrayim over the territory, Lot became greedy. Okay, if it wasn't for his uncle, he wouldn't have received any blessing. So the Torah tells us in last week's parsha, he set his eyes on Sodom, the modern version of Sin City in those days, but 1,000 times worse. And he went there and he realized he was in big trouble. Okay, one of the things I share in my other teaching on Parashat Vayeira is that the Midrash tells us, the Talmud tells us, that Sodom was not simply destroyed because of their homosexuality. Most people associate sodomy or sodomite is basically a stereotype for homosexuality and lesbian activity. That was the least of their problems. In fact, the book of Ezekiel tells us that they were very selfish. They were spoiled. They were very blessed on the fertility of the land. They were blessed. In fact, when next time you go to the Dead Sea, that entire region there, you're in the grounds of what was the major metroplex of 5 cities that God literally turned upside down. He flipped it upside down, inverted the earth, and they got swallowed in. And so they were destroyed. Meteorites and everything else that took place at that time. But they were very greedy. And they passed these crazy laws. If you think some of our liberal politicians are crazy with their progressive agendas, okay, you've seen nothing yet. And the fact that they continue the way they're going, I'm afraid to say they're going to be repeating, okay, the history of Sodom and Gomorrah. Chazal tell us that if a man, for an example, went off to work, he had a beautiful wife, and the neighbor saw the beautiful wife, and he wanted to help himself into that man's house and then raped the woman, okay? And the husband found out and they attempted to go to court. The court would basically rule in favor of the rapist and say it's not his fault that your wife looks sexy and looks beautiful. You should have basically concealed her. And because she was revealing and she looked gorgeous, he couldn't control his impulses. And then the court would rule that you can no longer keep her as yourself for your wife. The rapist gets her. You might be thinking, that's bogus. Yes, friends, that's actually what they did. They had many types of crazy laws. Like I said, if you were poor, you were sojourning in their town, very rich, and you were panhandling for a couple shekels here and there, people would give you lots of money. But when you would go to the store to buy some bread, nobody would sell you bread. Because they would say you were born to be poor, you're destined to die to be poor. And they would let you die of starvation. That's what they did. In fact, one of Lot's daughters, not the two who were destroyed with their husbands, Okay, and the two that made it out, but there was another daughter, a fifth daughter. Apparently, he had 5 daughters. A fifth daughter was killed. She was married to a judge in Sodom, and she was caught giving bread to a homeless person, and they killed her. So Lot comes from that. Mashiach comes from that. He comes from that generation. So what does this reveal to us as we close here? Because what's the principle? What are we learning here besides knowledge? The Torah is teaching us a very powerful and uplifting message. What is that uplifting message? The Torah comes to remind us, friends, that we should never allow our imperfections to hold us back from serving God, from running and serving Him. That's why Chazal said, look at the example of Lot's daughters. Look at the older daughter who, because of the action she took, merited to have Ruth enter into Israel 4 generations before Ne'emah. And that served as the holy root of the soul of Mashiach. Right? You might say, well, that's bad. It's not bad, because the intention was pure. And that teaches us that we should never allow our imperfections to hold us back from running to serve God. And that means, friends, even if you and I are not perfectly righteous, we don't have everything down packed, we're still a work in progress, Hashem can use our imperfections to mold and shape the coming of the Mashiach. You never know what you can trigger. That's why Chazal said, the actions of Lot's older daughter augmented time, where her descendant, Ruth, came into the covenant of the Jewish people by 4 generations. Even though the younger daughter slept with Lot the next night. You would think, well, hold on here. They're going to give birth at the same time. And that means that, how can one proceed by 4 generations? It's the attention, which meant that they were a mess. Their father made a mistake going to Sodom. And now he lost his wife, he lost his other daughters because of his foolish decision to abandon his uncle. But Hashem says, Gamzule Tova, even though you made a big mistake here, I'm going to work something miraculous. I'm going to use you to form the soul of Mashiach. Likewise, Hashem can use our imperfections, use our mistakes. That should never stop us from running to serve Him. I don't care where you're at in life and what you're struggling with. You may have addictions, you may have issues, but don't let that stop you from running to serve Hashem. Once again, friends, Mashiach is not a religious figure who sits with spiritually perfect people. Mashiach is a humble figure who reaches out to the sinner, to the lost sheep of Israel. That's who Mashiach is. And therefore, I would like to challenge you, wherever you are at, stop sitting there judging yourself based upon imperfections. Don't sit there and say, what can Hashem do with me? You don't know what Hashem can do with you. I challenge you to run and perform the mitzvot. Run to Hashem with your gifts and your talents and your time and your energy. And let Hashem do the rest. Because your actions are molding and shaping basically a platform for Mashiach. Our actions can bring Mashiach. Don't sit there and think, well, I'm not a Sadiq, I'm not a Malach. Who cares? From what we see here, Hashem was not interested in bringing Mashiach from Sadiqim. Now, and mind you, David was a Sadiq, okay? He's a righteous figure. But what made him righteous was his imperfections, that he continued to seek and serve Hashem. Chazal tell us that a Baal Shuvah, that the righteous can never stand in the place of a Baal Shuvah. The Baal Shuvah who comes to Hashem after tasting the exotic flavors of sin is a lot more holier and sits at a better place spiritually than a Sadiq. Someone who's from birth, someone who walks with Hashem. And mind you, it's a lifestyle for some people to envy of those who are raised observing Torah all their life. But not everyone does observe it. People are secular. People get caught up doing a lot of embarrassing things that they wish they never did. But Hashem takes those embarrassing things, those situations. He takes those shameful acts. And He says, I'm going to use this to mold this coming of Mashiach. So friends, I'd like to challenge you. Wherever you may be at in life, don't think that Hashem can't use your imperfections, because the soul of Mashiach comes from nothing but imperfections, nothing but sin. He uses our imperfections to perfect us. So I would challenge you, let Hashem use your imperfections to bring the coming of Mashiach, that He may receive honor and glory. If this teaching has been a blessing to you and anything that we do here at Sulam Yaakov, prayerfully consider supporting us with your financial contributions. You can find a link below there in the descriptions where it says see more. You can go to Sulam Yaakov, and you could donate, or some of the other social media platforms such as Facebook. And whatever you're able to give, we're very grateful. Thank you very much. It enables us to continue operating here full time, and we're very grateful for your support. And most importantly, we're very grateful for your prayers. Continue to keep us in your tefillot and your prayers. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me some emails, rabbi@70facesoftorah.com. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, may the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov bless you and your family. Shalom and Kol Tuv.